What would Kashimo's domain expansion do? Let's talk about it, but spoilers beware. All right, first of all, shout out to Professor who asked me about this and wanted to know if Kashimo had a domain, what would it be called and how would it work? And this is something I've talked about a little bit before with Kashimo, and personally, I don't think he could have a domain. Like, I just don't think that makes sense with what his technique is. But hypothetically, let's cook something up for him, right? And the only idea I really had to make sense of Mythical Beast Amber and to be kind of like a cool twist on it would be that his domain could be called like the sacrificial chamber or something like that. And since we know that Mythical Beast Amber will ultimately kill you when you use it, which is why you can only use it once, perhaps his domain's sure hit effect would be applying Mythical Beast Amber to his opponents, effectively giving them a death sentence after however long we want to say, right? And you could be like, well, whoa, you're basically giving his opponent a huge boost. And true. And so maybe that could be kind of like the double-edged sword of this. Kashimo would need to be confident that he could survive or defeat his opponent even with Mythical Beast Amber, at least long enough until it takes for it to kill them, right? But it also could be that somebody whose technique isn't Mythical Beast Amber is going to have no idea how to actually utilize it. So maybe it would just be them like dissipating into energy or something like that. So I just think that would be a cool concept that's like pretty unique as far as what we saw in JJK, and would also still technically follow the rule of, you know, only being able to use the technique once. It's just that he's forcing that upon his opponents. Next, Professor wanted to know how I thought Kashimo would have fared against 15-finger Sukuna, Shibuya Sukuna, and I think he gets cooked. I don't think there's anyone in the verse that can defeat 15-finger Sukuna. Aside from Satoru Gojo, of course. And then Professor says, what if Toji had listened to his gut and run away from awakened Teen Gojo instead of fighting him? And honestly, I don't know if much would change, because I feel like Gojo would just chase him. Like, he's not just going to let Toji run away. You know what I mean? So I would assume he'd probably still just die. But if we want to say that Toji is sufficiently faster than Gojo that he could have lost him, or just because of his lack of cursed energy could have like stealthily gotten away, then in that case, there's a whole bunch of different ways it could go, right? But I think the main thing would be that obviously Gojo would not be the one to raise Megami, and Megami would likely be sold to the Zenin clan. But then from there, we could say that, you know, any number of permutations to the timeline could happen. And then circling back around to Kashimo, I had a question from Simple who says, since domain amplification prevents you from using your technique at the same time, could Kashimo use domain amplification but still get the benefit of his electrical cursed energy? And I think so, because that isn't his technique, right? It's just an inherent property of his cursed energy. So I still think he could actively wield domain amp and still have his pseudo sure hit effect of his electricity, like, you know, attracting itself between the positive and negative charges. So domain amp would be a pretty big boost for Kashimo, but realistically, it doesn't help him against many people aside from Gojo, right? But still, it would be nice. The real question just becomes, can you use domain amp if you don't have a domain expansion? And maybe you can, but the only people we saw use it were people with domains. Then also on Kashimo, I just wanted to shout out Jojo, who sent in some support, but with no question or anything, just in response to my what if Kashimo had swap trained video, saying that there's not really much that Kashimo can actually gain that's going to make a difference. And I entirely agree. I think the main thing would be RCT, but that just assumes that like he takes damage in a fight that would have killed him that he wouldn't have used Mythical Beast Amber in, which I'm assuming that's a very small window of potential fights, right? So yes, he could theoretically get some things to help him, but, you know, in practice, I don't really think there's much he could gain that help him win fights that he previously would have lost. Like, he was either already going to win or already going to lose, regardless of if he had things like Domain Amp or RCT. And then speaking of Domain Amp, Video sent in a comment and says that Sukuna, even with using Domain Amp against Gojo, was kind of getting manhandled and thrown around seemingly without much agency. And he wanted to know, like, what's going on here? Is this what every opponent of Gojo could come to expect? And, you know, I think this is one of the memes, but also like facts of this battle, is that Gojo largely dominated the hand-to-hand. Now, is that just a product of his curse technique being better in that way because it forces your opponent to use Domain Amp, but also he can use like blue to make his punches even stronger? You know, he can just largely have his way with people because of the telekinesis he's capable of. And sure, but I also think that this is a very specific snapshot of their fight, and it's not as if he was just dogging Sukuna literally from start to finish, right? This is like Black Flash amped Gojo like having his moment. But we ultimately know how the fight ended, right? So it comes down to more than just specific snapshots. And a lot of people like to argue that Sukuna in his true body would have leveled the playing field here. Maybe he would have, maybe he wouldn't have, but this is just one facet that I think Gojo won in the fight that we actually saw. And then Video asked me another question about Gojo and Sukuna where we hypothetically swap their domains. So Gojo has an open domain, Sukuna has a closed domain. In that scenario, would Gojo be capable of destroying Sukuna's closed domain's barrier? And honestly, I don't think so, right? It's because Sukuna's domain was slashes that they could bombard Gojo's barrier. But in a reverse situation, Gojo's unlimited void is just infinite information, right? So at least to me, it doesn't seem like it would be able to destroy Sukuna's barrier in the same way. And then Video's final question to me was, did we ever figure out whether Mahoraga needs time or quantity to adapt? And the answer is both. So the way Mahoraga works is if we hit it with something, he will start to adapt to that thing. And it will just take him some amount of time to adapt to it fully, right? And he will also adapt to things multiple ways, if that makes sense, because we saw him do this to Gojo's Limitless, right? The first time he bypassed it was something Sukuna couldn't copy, but then a later adaptation was something that Sukuna could copy. So it just takes time. However, quantity, meaning if we hit Mahoraga with the same attack multiple times, will speed up that process. So the more exposure he has to something, the more efficient his adaptation becomes, which is why Gojo wasn't trying to use, purple or red unless he had to, because he didn't want to help Mahoraga adapt to those things quicker. And then speaking of open versus closed domains, I got a couple of other questions on this from Makima, starting with this one, which says, could a closed domain beat an open domain by shrouding its outer shell in many layers of barriers? And honestly, I don't think so, at least not in the way of just like, I cast my domain and then it has 4 other barriers surrounding it as like armor, because I just don't think that's like how the process works. Like, you cast your domain and that's it. You couldn't really then subsequently cast barriers that appear around it. However, I think what accomplishes kind of the same thing at the end of the day is what we saw Gojo do, wherein he manipulated the binding vows and the formula of his domain in such a way that his outer barrier was strengthened. But obviously, to give something, or to get something, you got to give something, right? Which is why the inside of his domain became weaker. So there are things you can do, but I don't think you could just, create 15 barriers on the outside of your domain just because you wanted to. And then Makima asked, can you create anything you want inside of an advanced barrier, like how Kenjaku created that movie theater? And if so, could you technically create like a backroom style domain that just tried to starve your opponents? And I think yes and no here. And in particular, the backroom style domain you talked about is kind of like what we saw Utahime and Meme go through at the beginning of season 2, when they were in that like never-ending labyrinth of an innate domain. So yes, I think something like that is possible, but it would either like need to be your domain expansion or something like incredibly advanced and nuanced as a barrier technique that wasn't a domain. So kind of like what Kenjaku did, but at the end of the day, that wasn't that powerful. But if he had tried to do something like create this, I think it would have to lean more towards domain expansion as opposed to just, I can create a barrier with literally anything I want inside of it. So it's possible, but I think there are still rules we'd have to follow here. And then finally today, I got this comment from that one guy, which doesn't have a question. He just says, hey, I'm a new subscriber, and he wanted to show some support. And my guy, thank you so much. I'm glad you found your way to the community. And that's going to do it for this one, my friends. As always, thank you so much for watching.